Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock, episode 198. This week the questions are taken from the Wednesday video on the Civil Air Patrol and the 5-minute guide, guide 245 to the Audacious class carriers of the Royal Navy. But before we get stuck into questions, just a quick question. You can comment obviously down below. Last couple of weeks, we've had the Patreon Drydocks split over two separate weeks because I was too shattered coming back from the America trip to manage it all in one, what would have turned out to probably be about 5-hour Drydock. Now, a few people have commented that they find it easier to listen to two separate, approximately 2.5-hour to 3-hour Drydocks. Now, I might start a poll in the community tab if there seems to be a clear, a not clear split. If there's a definite one, then I'll probably just go with that decision. But, let me know in the comments below. With the Patreon Drydocks, do you prefer having them in two approximately 2.5 to 3-hour blocks, or would you prefer them to stay at their current single length? The main caveat on that, I don't mind particularly either way, is that of course if the Patreon Drydock takes up 2 weekends of a typical month, then the regular Drydock, which we're having today, only will be available 2 weeks out of 4 instead of 3 weeks out of 4 as it is at the moment. So let me know in the comments below. As I say, if there's a clear wish one way or the other, then I'll go with that. If it's kind of 6 of one, half dozen of the other, then I'll start a poll for the wider community separately and see what happens. Anyway, on with questions. B Huang92 asks, how did Germany's early coastal defence warships compare to their neighbours before their big naval expansion programme? Well, if you look at the time that Germany was building coastal defence ships as opposed to their ironclads, so you're talking about the 1890s basically, and compare them to the other coastal defence ships that were being built at the time, they compare pretty well. They're not the best. There's 1 or 2 classes, particularly the Austro-Hungarian versions, that would rate higher, and there's a few others that theoretically have more firepower, usually mounting a couple of 12-inch guns or similar, albeit, as the Matsushima-class discovered, although they're not coastal defence ships, but they're of roughly the same kind of displacement, 12-inch guns on ships of 5,000 or less tons displacement doesn't necessarily always work, so on-paper stats don't always marry up with in real-world capability. But they're easily in, the top 85th percentile of coastal defence ships. I'd say the Austro-Hungarian ships definitely are generally slightly better, and again they are slightly bigger, so you would expect that. And I'd say there's 1 or 2 others you could probably make a decent argument for being a little better than the German ones. But considering you're talking about a class of several dozen, well, over a dozen different designs, the Germans placing in kind of roughly somewhere between 2nd and 4th, depending on exactly how you argue things, is not bad at all, especially considering that, Germany as a country hadn't existed for more than a couple of decades at that point, and the German shipyards, which built them, had only really in the past decade or two actually started building major warships. So pretty good showing for the German coast defence ships, with, of course, the caveat that they are small coast defence ships. They are not going to be scaring the big pre-dreadnoughts anytime soon. Dejan Gabrovsek asks, how many personnel did admirals usually have on the flagship, and what was their role? It varies hugely. Obviously, on an Age of Sail ship, then what the admiral's staff are supposed to do is going to vary very differently from what an admiral's staff is supposed to do on, say, a World War II vessel. And in World War II, it's also going to depend on what kind of ship the admiral is on. So if the admiral is, say, on a battleship and has a relatively small task group around him, like, say, Lütjen's on Bismarck when he's only got Prince Eugen with him, then that's going to be a very different job to, say, Admiral Halsey's staff when he's mostly got to coordinate carriers, or Admiral Lee's staff if he's coordinating large numbers of battleships. And then, of course, it also depends on the admiral. Now, using World War II as an example, Admiral Lee only had 1 or 2 members of his staff for quite a while. He didn't see the need for any more. It did grow later on, but that was with need and with advancing systems. So, typically, an admiral's staff may be around 8 to 14 people. It could get larger, it could be a lot smaller, but that seems to be about the average for most World War II admirals that I've found. Now, there'll be at least one secretary who's just taking letters and messages dictated by the admiral and handling his incoming mail. There'll usually be a couple of signals officers. Back in the First World War and earlier, they'd be literally flag signals officers dealing with signals to and from various ships. By the time of World War II, obviously dealing a lot more with radio and encrypted messages and so forth. There would also be a few tacticians. These would usually be captains or something like that, brought in out from other elements of the service, who would be advising the captain on, or the admiral on what may or may not be a good idea in terms of battle tactics. There'd also be within that element people looking at intel, so incoming intelligence, filtering it through, giving the admiral what he needed to know, rather than dumping an entire theatre's worth of mostly irrelevant data on him. And that you could even get to the point where you'd have a cook for the admiral, or a butler, or someone like that, especially if that isn't provided by the ship that he's on. There could also be a logistics officer or 2. And again, all of these, whether you have one of them or none of them or many of them, would depend on how big the workload is. But effectively, the idea is that the admiral will say, I want this done, and the staff will generate all the paperwork and the orders necessary to get that done throughout whatever formation the admiral is commanding. And also, as we mentioned with the signals officers, to gather in all the information and filter it down into a nice compact form that the admiral can understand without him having to be awake 26 hours a day. Removed Rhino asks, around what time were flagships first used in the world's navies? Pretty much from the first moment that people put flags on warships, because this was one of the major things that was a problem when it came to commanding fleets before the advent of things like radio, and indeed complex signal flags, was basically, how does the rest of the fleet know what it's supposed to be doing? Because in theory you could give everybody orders beforehand, but you'd require a sort of 10th level dimensional genius to predict exactly what would happen throughout the entirety of an engagement, unless you're going to give them war and peace, except it's all naval tactics. You can't anticipate every likely scenario. And then can you imagine someone sitting there on the on the deck of a trireme with several slaves worth of scrolls going, okay, well, according to scroll VIII, subsection 7, in the event of the enemy turning left and when the sun is high and the albatrosses are flying from port to starboard, we should do this. It's not going to work. So you're faced with either issuing orders and then realizing that half the time it's not going to work, which usually ends in disaster, letting everybody kind of do their own thing, which usually also ends in disaster, or some way of communicating at least general intentions to your opponent. Your opponents is, I want you to die. Communicating your intentions to the rest of your own ships, however, needs to be done in some fashion. Now, trumpet blasts and stuff were obviously a favoured method before major signal flags were invented. But then the problem arises, well, anyone with a trumpet could therefore start giving weird orders and throw everything into confusion. So how do you tell whether or not that order is legitimate? Well, hoist a big pennant flag thing on the ship, and then everyone say, yes, this is the ship we must follow. And then, so if the trumpet blast or the drum roll or whatever comes from that ship, then we do what they say. And if it comes from another ship, well, then they're an imposter and we ignore them at best, and possibly run them down and kill them at worst. So that is, the best way of in the time dealing with things. So therefore, the flagship with the commander's flag, whatever it happened to be, is a very, very, very old thing. Obviously, during what are colloquially called the Dark Ages, there weren't that many organised navies around outside of the Byzantines, but when generally people started picking up having organised navies again, one of the very first things you ever saw was, right, there is a flag, usually a royal standard of some kind, and then later an admiral's flag, which designates the flagship, i.e. the command vessel. Psycho Brahe asks, has marine life ever affected the outcome of a battle? Any era, anything, fish, sharks, whales, maybe bioluminescent plankton, etc. Surprisingly enough, yes, the bioluminescent aspect has definitely affected more than a few battles, both in terms of people changing their tactics to take account of the fact they don't want the bioluminescence to give away their position, and other people who perhaps either themselves haven't realised that it gives away their position and then been surprise attacked, or people who have had warning that an enemy ship is coming because they've spotted bioluminescence. In fact, looking for bioluminescence in the wakes of ships was one of the ways in which night-flying aircraft could spot hostile warships in World War II, especially in the Pacific, where that kind of thing is a little bit more common than you get in most of the Atlantic. Now, in terms of general marine life, at least in the more modern context, that hasn't really had a huge effect on battles once battles have been joined, mainly because the ships involved are much bigger and much faster than any marine life. Obviously, in the aftermath of battles, there have been effects like, the somewhat slightly overblown but still very nasty shark attacks on the survivors of USS Indianapolis, and various bits of sea life provoking battles that actually didn't really happen as battles because it turns out one side wasn't there, it was just people shooting at sea life. The further back in time you go, as ships get smaller and smaller, then yes, there would have been sea life that would have affected the battles, but to get back far enough where major sea combatants were small enough that something like sharks, large schools of fish, or a pod of whales might actually have manifestly changed or influenced the outcome of events, well, you get into a period that is not particularly well documented, and what is documented is, half myth and legend anyway. So it'd be more difficult to come up with specific examples at that point, although the ancillary to that is riverine battles, where ships started off small and remained small for the most part for much longer periods of time. Some of those very definitely were affected by various forms of water-borne life. And there's various accounts I remember from places like ancient Egypt, where sea battles could be disrupted by very angry hippos who decided that they did not like all the disturbance and they were going to smash everything that was disturbing them. Hippos being quite difficult things to deal with at the best of times, let alone when they're in the water trying to rip apart your relatively fragile ship. HMS King George V asks, I noticed that, at least from what I've seen, some of the sources covering the belt and deck thickness of the King George V class differ on what the base stats were, either a 15-inch belt and 6-inch deck, or a 14.7-inch belt and a 5.8-inch deck. Now, I know armour would be close but not exact when it was made, but I don't think that explains why some books differ about this, and also which set of data is more accurate to use. Now, this arises from a Royal Navy practice in how they specified their armour belts. So they worked on the basis of 1 inch of steel over 1 square foot equated approximately 40 pounds of weight. It's actually just a fraction more than that. But it meant that when you were ordering armour plate, it was ordered in pounds, i.e., a 600-pound plate, for example. And then obviously you'd multiply that up by however many square feet the big armour plate was, because obviously armour plate doesn't come in 1 square foot blocks. And then that would give you the total weight of the armour plate that was to be manufactured. And obviously weight considerations are a fairly important thing. The problem is, by using a slightly smaller rule of thumb weight of 40 pounds instead of the actual 40.8 pounds for the density of the kind of steel alloy, well, steel is an alloy, but steel alloyed with other elements that would go into armour plate, you could end up with plating that was, in theory, very slightly thinner than the nominal thickness. So if you assumed that steel was 40 pounds per square foot per inch of thickness, and you ask for a 600-pound plate, that would equate to 15 inches because that's 600 over 40. But if you were given an actual 600-pound plate, it would be 14.7 inches thick, and so on and so forth. Now, the problem with where the confusion lies is, one, obviously there was a target thickness, 15 inches, versus, in theory, by weight, an actual nominal thickness of 14.7, plus the fact that British record keeping kind of swerves back and forth between the two. So some documents describing a particular ship will describe the armour plate by weight, and other documents will describe it by inches of thickness, planned inches of thickness. Other documents will describe it by actual inches of thickness, and other documents will use all three interchangeably, which really doesn't help. Then, of course, you have the manufacturing tolerances and the fact that it can be very confusing if someone is asked for, let's say a plate of, using arbitrary units, 100 square feet. So that's your 600 pounds multiplied by 100. So you're now being asked for a 60,000 pound by weight plate of armour. And then you manufacture it. Well, within manufacturing tolerances, there's usually about a quarter of an inch leeway because, manufacturing a plate that thick, you're not going to get it perfectly smooth. And that could be ground down if it was overly thick. But if you think about it, if you're a British armour plate manufacturer and you're being told, well, I want a 60,000 pound plate that is 15 inches thick, which is the kind of dual purpose documentation you'd get, and you make your approximately 60,000 pound plate, and then you do measurements and you notice, well, this part is 14.6 inches, this part is 15.1 inches, and it varies back and forth. What exactly are you going to do? Are you going to thin it down where all the sort of raised areas are until you get exactly 60,000 pounds of weight? Are you going to look at the document and go, well, it says 15 inches, so I guess we just thin it down where it's above 15 inches, and maybe if it ends up overweight, so be it? Or do you try and reach some kind of compromise solution? Well, we don't have any King George V's left to measure, so we don't know exactly what each manufacturer did. This is one of the things with having the US museum ships. If the questions like this arise for how much is a 40-pound plate of special treatment steel, which is actually a legitimate thing because the US did occasionally use this kind of rule of thumb as well. You can go on a US ship, find a 1-inch thick plate of STS steel and go, a 40-pound plate of STS steel, measure it and go, this is either an inch or it's slightly narrower than an inch, 0.98 of an inch or something like that. And then say, right, well, this is what that manufacturer did with that specification. We can't do that with the British ships. So it kind of, it's a little bit up in the air. I mean, 0.3 of an inch probably doesn't make all that much odds, but this is the reason for the differences. So where it says 15 inches of belt armour and 6 inches of deck armour, that's what the intended thickness was. 14.7 and 5.8 are what the thickness would be if the British manufacturers were going by the exact weight specified. And then it's a case of, well, if you want to know exactly, roughly, because as I said, it's not going to be a uniform smooth surface, but if you want to know roughly what the actual thickness was, you'd have to go through, if they survive, the manufacturing records for each armour plate on each ship, and look at, what is its dimensions, length, width, and obviously target depth is what you're looking to do. So you can go, right, well, we've got the surface area of the plate, and at 40 pounds per square foot, it should weigh this much. At 40.8, it should weigh this much. Its actual weight is this. Divide through by both, work out the difference, and you're like, okay, well, it's actually probably an average of this. So which data set is more accurate to use? You can use both, but without doing a plate-by-plate analysis, again, as I said, assuming that the documents are, which, to be honest, for World War II ships, they probably have somewhere, it's not going to be exactly possible to work out the precise reality of the situation. which, as I say, it could vary from ship by ship, and it could even vary plate by plate within certain tolerances. Adam Alton asks, after watching the rather interesting video you did on the Nassau-class dreadnought of the Imperial German Navy, can you offer any additional insight into what the Germans were thinking? The ship sounded like an absolute Charlie Foxtrot. There are two major issues with the Nassaus, one of which is kind of on the Germans. Well, they're both on the Germans, but for different reasons, but you'll see what I mean. So one issue is their handling. They tended to roll quite badly when they turned. They tended to lose a lot of speed when they turned. And, that didn't make them particularly brilliant warships. But this was an issue that was found with a relatively large number of German warships at the time and going forward a little bit. Now, so that much is on the German designers. The underwater profile and the metacentric height of the ships wasn't necessarily brilliant. The other part, so that's just poor design to a degree. The other element is the hexagonal layout and the speed, and that's all tied together. And the hexagonal layout obviously is quite inefficient. You put 12 guns on a ship for an 8-gun broadside. Dreadnought obviously manages to do the same broadside with 10 guns, and South Carolina does it with 8 guns. So there's inefficiencies involved there. Plus, if you've got amidships plus two big wing turrets on either side, that's going to increase your beam perhaps a little bit more than you'd want. And then the use of vertical triple expansion engines means you can't go as fast, you can't go at whatever speed you're going at for as long, compared to turbines with the same square footage. Now, all of that all comes back to turbines and Parsons and the German High Command, because at the time that the Nassaus were being built, the only place you could get turbine engines of the scale that you needed to drive battleships was from Parsons, which were an English-British company. And, well, they wanted an awful lot of money for the licensing to have their design. And the Germans weren't willing to pay that. Plus, of course, at the time, if you bought a Parsons turbine and something went wrong with it, then you had to ask Parsons for help. And since Germany was building a fleet to kind of counteract the British, well, having the people that you might possibly end up at war with being the ones holding the keys as to whether or not your ships actually work, not necessarily the soundest of tactical decisions. As I say, the alternative would be to just go, okay, well, we will pay you a license fee so we can have the design, so we can set up our own manufactories, so we can make our own spare parts, but they didn't want to pay that money either. They wanted to wait until German industry could come up with their own turbines, which would be much, much cheaper, which is what they did, which is why subsequent German ship classes would have turbines. But all of that was in the future at the time the Nassaus were being built, and so basically through being just a little bit tight on the purse, they ended up with the vertical triple expansion engines. The vertical triple expansion engines took up a lot more space to get the ships up to anything like a reasonable speed, quite apart from the other limitations in terms of how long they could run, but nevertheless, because they took up an awful lot of speed amidship, an awful lot of space amidships in order to get the speed, that meant there wasn't enough space on the centre line of the Nassaus to put the turrets and their barbettes and magazines, etc., if you want to do it all centre line. And that meant that if you wanted to have firepower, then you had to position the turrets on the wings in a manner of a pre-dreadnought, because that was the only place you had any available hull volume, and so they did. And of course, if you want your 8-gun broadside, which Dreadnought and South Carolina and Kawaichi had kind of established as your minimum, or were in the process of establishing, depending on how far along in the build they were, had established as the basic kind of, this is what a Dreadnought's broadside is at minimum, well, then that's how you end up with this 6-gun hexagonal inefficient layout. Dreadnought, obviously, as discussed in the video on Dreadnought, could have had her armament entirely on the centre line and could have had, a 10-gun, or even if she'd gone Super Atlanta style, the 12-gun broadside. But Fisher wanted all ahead firepower as much as humanly possible, and then she had her wing turrets. It's one of the advantages of turbine engines, and then the disadvantage of having a slightly monofocused designer or head of design. So, yeah, that's basically why the Nassaus ended up with the issues that they did. Germany was just a couple of years technologically behind on a key propulsion element, and that kind of cascaded into most of the other issues that the Germans ended up facing with them. Arctic Temper asks, what exactly is the difference between the First Sea Lord and the First Lord of the Admiralty in World War One? So the First Sea Lord is the top Royal Navy officer, unless you get an Admiral of the fleet, but otherwise the First Sea Lord is the top-ranking Royal Navy officer. He is in charge of the Navy. He has various other Sea Lords, Second Sea Lord, Third Sea Lord, and so on, to run specific departments, but he is the boss, kind of an Admiral King figure if you want a US Navy equivalent. The First Lord of the Admiralty is supposed to be his civilian counterpart appointed by the government, and obviously therefore that changes a lot quicker than necessarily First Sea Lord appointments can. First Sea Lord appointments, depending on the time period, can either have a roughly fixed term, or they might just run till the incumbent retires or dies, which, if you promote someone who has particularly good health, could take a while. Whereas the First Lord of the Admiralty, by and large, will change with each government that comes through. Occasionally, someone would do such a brilliant job as the First Lord of the Admiralty that even if the government changed to the opposite political party, they might still keep him in place. But as time went on and politics became more and more partisan, that became less and less of a thing. And also, the First Lord of the Admiralty could even be changed within the terms of a single government if the person in question fell out of favour with the government or was seen to be doing a bad job, or someone else wanted the position, or whatever other fickle whims of politician stupidity was going on at the time. About the only thing that was, you could say, that was positive of the role of First Lord of the Admiralty, other than obviously supposed to bring in a different point of view from all the career naval officers, was that usually, and I stress usually, at the time when the First Lord of the Admiralty was a thing, people tended to take the Navy and Britain's armed forces a little bit more seriously, so it was a position that was usually fairly coveted. It was open to corruption. There were periods where people appointed First Lords of the Admiralty purely through nepotism, and they really just raked it in with lots of money and corruption and usually let the Navy fall into rack and ruin. Fortunately, the competent First Lords of the Admiralty tended to outnumber the incompetent ones over the broad span of time. Unfortunately, these days the position of Minister of Defence is, in the UK, seen more as a graveyard for political careers. If you really want to be Minister of Defence, you can pretty much guarantee you're going to get it because no one else will. So it's probably just as well the position of First Lord of the Admiralty doesn't exist anymore. And occasionally, if you go back far enough in history, you actually find naval officers filling the role of First Lord of the Admiralty as well as First Sea Lord, usually when they are somewhat older, because, back in the days, 1700s and so forth, a lot of the time, high-ranking Royal Navy officers did kind of have one foot in one world, one foot in the other. A lot of them would serve as MPs and so forth. So you could end up with somebody who was both a high-ranking admiral in the Royal Navy, but also, because they were part of the parliamentary political structure, might end up being appointed as First Lord of the Admiralty, technically separate from their rank as admiral in the Royal Navy, which is a bit weird. Knight6831 asks, were the two Audacious class coming up to the end of their lives by the 1970s? Would it be right that two Audacious class would have retired at the end of the 1980s if they'd lasted long enough? The way that things worked out, yeah, that by the end of the 70s, the two Audacious class were pretty much done. But it could have been different. It could have been very different. The thing is that Ark Royal was actually in materially worse condition right from the very start, because Eagle was built, launched pretty quickly. Ark Royal was held on the stocks for quite a while, and they didn't do a very good job at preserving her during that time. I mean, obviously, ideally, you'd put her in a giant shed or under a giant tarp, but that wasn't done, so a lot of water got in places it shouldn't have been, caused a lot of issues which were never entirely solved. So, materially speaking, Eagle was the better ship. However, when it came time to go through periodic refit, Eagle got a fairly extensive refit in the late 60s, right before the Royal Navy decided it was going to start operating Phantoms. So when Ark Royal came up for refit in the early 70s, Ark Royal was then refitted relatively minimally to carry Phantoms, which meant that once you got into the 70s, in the wonderful decision-making of the British government, they decided they weren't going to fund the Navy much at all, which meant the Royal Navy couldn't afford the crews to man two carriers, two big ones anyway. And so, well, one of them would have to go, and at that particular stage in time, Ark Royal could operate Phantoms and Eagle could not. Eagle could, of course, have been refitted to operate Phantoms, but the government didn't want to spend any more money because, spending money on the thing that keeps your nation free and secure is apparently anathema. Much better to, stick a bunch of money over to your mates in hedge funds and other industrial companies that will give you a nice retirement plan. But anyway, and so they decided, well, Eagle's going to go into reserve instead, and be decommissioned, at which point she was kept around through most of the 70s basically as a spare parts store for Ark Royal, even though, as I said, Ark Royal was in a materially much worse condition. And due to that, despite the fact that Ark Royal did have a bunch of refits during the 70s, by the end of the 1970s, she really, really was on her absolute last legs, and off she went into the scrapyards in the very beginning of the 80s. The reason I say everything could have been different is that if Ark Royal had been the one that had the refit in the late 60s, and then Eagle had followed up with having the later refit in the early 70s, then it would have been Eagle that would have had the capability to operate Phantoms and not Ark Royal. Eagle cost a lot less to maintain and run per year because she was in a much materially better condition. And so if Ark Royal had been the one that had then gone off into the reserve fleet to act as a spare parts store for Eagle, it's entirely possible that with costing somewhat less to upgrade and run, Eagle might have received somewhat better upgrades in the 70s anyway, and Eagle probably would have been, at least in a material state, to continue serving well into the early 80s, assuming that, the government wanted to give them more than 4 shillings and sixpence to try and run the entire Navy. But there wouldn't have been anything that would have physically prevented Eagle from still being around in, say, 1982. Whether or not she would have lasted all the way through to the end of the 1980s, I don't know. Physically speaking, she probably could have. Practically speaking, by that point, the government had decided that the Royal Navy was going to become basically the glorified NATO anti-submarine warfare squadron, and there's no place for a fleet carrier in an anti-submarine warfare squadron, and so she probably would have gone to the breakers in probably somewhere between 83 and 85. But that's politics for you. Osiski-Vilski, I think, I do apologise if I've just horribly mangled your name, asks, was the Iowa-class overweight like Bismarck? Richelieu had the same speed and similar armour for much less weight, only the armament was a bit smaller. Not really. So, obviously, the Iowas were designed initially as 45,000-ton ships. Richelieu was designed as a 35,000-ton ship. Both ships came out about 2,500 tons above their designed weight as on standard displacement by the time they're actually in service. But it's reasonable to look at that and go, okay, well then Richelieu is still 10,000 tons lighter than Iowa. So where's all the big difference? Well, there's a few things. Firstly, the Richelieu is 32 knots and a bit, whereas Iowa is 33 knots and change, able to go a little bit faster than that when they would really want to push it. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but to get that additional knot and a bit requires quite the substantial increase in shaft horsepower. In fact, it needs about a third more power than Richelieu does just for that extra knot and a bit. And obviously, if you're going to have a third more power generated, that means you need to have bigger more boilers, and the machinery is obviously going to have to handle that extra power as well. So all of that's going to lead to heavier machinery, which also needs more space, which means the displacement's going to go up. Also range. The Iowas at their cruising speed can go about 50% further than Richelieu can, so that means they're going to have to carry a lot more fuel. And at battleship scales, fuel at maximum load weighs several thousand tons, so that's going to add to the displacement as well. As you mentioned, yes, the ship does carry a slightly larger main battery, and that is, well, not only just one extra gun, that adds a few hundred more tons of weight, but also Iowa's main battery is distributed in 3 turrets, so you have 3 sets of gun houses, 3 sets of barbettes, 3 sets of everything. Richelieu gets away with 2. Now, admittedly, Richelieu's turrets will be, being quad 15s, will be slightly larger, but overall, 3 triple turrets, including all the ancillaries that we just mentioned, will weigh more than 2 quads. You get an extra gun for it, but there will be a substantial weight increase. It's just a design choice that people make. It doesn't necessarily make the ship overweight because, 3 triples, 2 fore, 1 aft was kind of a fairly standard design choice for the 1930s and 1940s. As you mentioned, protection, armour-wise, vaguely similar enough that there's not going to be a substantial weight change caused by that, albeit that technically speaking, Iowa, I think, has a little bit more overall deck plating once you add up all the various thicknesses, which will probably make it, plus the slightly larger size overall for all the reasons we've mentioned before, will probably give it a slight increase to overall displacement. Secondary armament you can kind of write off because Iowa, yes, it has more of its heavy secondary guns because it's got 25-inch guns, whereas Richelieu only has 9 of its 152mm guns. However, again, the flip side to that is that the Richelieu also has a bunch of lighter guns. So for its AA, they're still heavy AA guns. So I think that kind of all balances out. Now, with all those various differences, the greater range, 3 turret design, etc., that explains most of why the Iowas displace more. But the other thing that people sometimes don't appreciate is also the light and medium anti-aircraft battery, because each of those guns weighs a reasonable amount with its mountings, whether that's a 20mm Oerlikon or a 40mm Bofors, and you've got to install not just the guns and their mountings in fairly large numbers, you've also got to take aboard the crew to maintain and operate them, you've got to take aboard the supplies for the crew, you've got to take aboard various accommodation stocks, whether that be bunk beds or hammocks or whatever happens to be on your ship for the crew. You've got to take on food for the crew. There's an awful lot of weight associated with the crew for these relatively small caliber weapons, which are present in large numbers. And you kind of start to see that because once Richelieu comes out of her 1943 refit, and she has now a similar level of light to medium anti-aircraft batteries as the Iowas do, all of a sudden her displacement's gone up to almost 44,000 tons. So now the displacement difference between the two is 3,000 to 4,000 tons, not 10,000, which is suddenly a lot narrower of a margin, at which point, as I said, factor in 3 turrets versus 2, the extra fuel and the other bits and the extra machinery that we mentioned, and actually all of a sudden the efficiency is pretty much the same in terms of design. Richelieu does have some rather magical boilers compared to most others, but yeah, once you look at like for like late 1940s, late World War II equipment, the weight difference between, or displacement difference between Iowa and Richelieu is entirely explicable by the additional features that Iowa has. It's not a hallmark of being overweight. Bill Luster asks, given how little use the standard classes gave in early World War II, would the US Navy have been better off abandoning the Colorados to make more Lexingtons, with guns, not planes, or smaller battle cruisers in the 1920s? If nothing else, they might have offered good carrier screens in 1942 and 43, similar to what the Congos offered for the Japanese. I wouldn't necessarily say so in that particular balance of circumstances. For one thing, a major problem that the US would have faced, and well, did historically face in any case, was fuel. The availability of fast fleet oilers. So the fact that they didn't have a fast battleship in commission immediately kind of hid the fact that they probably couldn't have kept it fueled along with their carrier force anyway. They might stretch things here or there, but realistically speaking, it's not a likely scenario. Obviously, as more fast fleet oilers are moved over to the Pacific, they are able to. That's why North Carolina is around, certainly by the time of the Guadalcanal campaign. So in the situation of, well, they've got a bunch more fast ships for escort duties. Yeah, Lexingtons or smaller battle cruisers built in the 20s would have been more useful in the early to mid part of the US's involvement in World War II than the standards. However, the Colorados were still some fairly big, mean fighting machines, and as long as, people didn't just move away from them. So if the US was looking at the situation in the run-up to the Washington Treaty going, okay, well, we kind of want to get a few more ships in rather than, potentially ending up with a somewhat obsolete battle line at the rear end of things. The problem with going with the Lexingtons would have been their sheer size. They would have had to carve out exceptions for them, and if they'd carved out exceptions for them, then everyone else would have wanted exceptions. So, if you build a couple of Lexingtons, that means the Royal Navy gets a couple of G3s, which is probably a good thing overall for the Allies between the two of them, but it also means the Japanese get a couple of Amagis, which in the long term is probably not such a good thing. And it would have been very difficult for that argument to be made, because obviously the British would be going, right, we want some G3s, we want some 16-inch ships. The British probably would have then gone, well, actually, if you're going to have Lexingtons and Colorados, so you're going to have this whole load of 16-inch ships, we want more G3s than you're having Lexingtons, which, given the political tension of the time, that would have been an interesting set of arguments to be made. If they'd gone for smaller battle cruisers, so let's say they'd chopped a turret out and gone, okay, we're going to downsize the Lexingtons, maybe make them 32, 33 knot ships with 6 16-inch guns, just one single aft turret, cut down the size, and we can maybe fit that into 35,000 tons, then given the size of US shipbuilding, I mean, if they had to, absolutely had to, then you could probably make a marginal argument for saying, okay, maybe they could do those instead of the Colorados, and yes, at that point, 35,000 ton, basically 16-inch renown equivalents would have been quite useful carrier escorts. However, if I was the US and I had that kind of design on spec and I was happy with it in the early 20s, I probably would have tried to trade off some of my older ships, the 12-inch ships certainly, maybe New York as well, in order to, drop some of my oldest vessels in order to get some new ones, as well as the Colorados. And now, if that means at 35,000 tons having to make concessions to the Royal Navy and the Japanese, then that's another matter, because you're forcing the Japanese to come up with something entirely from scratch, or maybe the Japanese just get an extra Nagato or two, and the British either just get more Nelsons, or maybe they build some F3s, a couple of F3s to go with, to match up with your smaller battle cruisers. That's probably a more reasonable compromise the US Navy would have gone for. But yes, whatever the case is, however they got them, Lexingtons or Lexington diminutives probably would have been very useful carrier escorts for World War II. Hi Bacon Bomb asks, many different ships had different setups for their main turrets. Some had twin turrets, but lots of them, whilst others had quad turrets, but only a few. Which setup proved to be the best balance between firepower and weight? And were the Germans the only nation to name their turrets an actual name, or did other navies do it as well? Officially, I think that with Anton Bruno, Caesar Dora, etc., I think the Germans were the only ones that actually went with full-on names for their turrets. The British obviously went with A, B, C, and X, Y, Z, P and Q amidships. The Americans went with the turret caliber plus the turret number, so 16.1, 16.2, 16.3, etc. Now, in terms of what's the most efficient layout for firepower versus tonnage, in terms of, do you want a twin, a triple, or a quad turret, it's very difficult to quantify because, for one thing, if you take into account the broadside, i.e. the weight of shell, that's obviously going to vary nation to nation because different nations will use different sized and therefore, different weighted shells, even if they notionally are using the same caliber. So, for example, the Nelson's shells are about 20 to 25% lighter than the Iowas, even though they are both 16-inch shells. And Bismarck shells are about 10% lighter than the 15-inch shells used on Richelieu or Littorio, for example. So, you might have a different firepower per ton rating based purely on how many shells, so the weight of the shells, which is a national characteristic, whereas if you use the same weight of shells in different turrets, you might have a different result. The problem is most nations didn't go in for having twins and triples and quads of the same gun. The only one where it's really possible to do an absolute direct comparison is with a King George V, and that's just a comparison between twin and quad. Now, if you do a direct comparison between the weight of the King George V's twin and the weight of the King George V's quad turret, then you do actually find the quad is much more efficient. If you're using tons for the weight of the turret with its guns and kilos for the weight of the broadside, you end up with a figure of 1.51, or rounded 1.52, in terms of firepower per ton for the quad, but only 1.34 for firepower per ton for the twin. So the quad is a more efficient gun at that point. But when you start to compare across nations, different nations protect their turrets differently, different thicknesses of armour, which is going to affect the turret's weight, and we already mentioned the different weights of shell. I tried to do a rough comparison for 15 and 16-inch turrets that were serviceable in the World War II periods. I used Richelieu, Iowa, Bismarck, Littorio, King George V, obviously for the quads as well, and Nelson, just to have another 666, because, amongst other things, the very heavy weight of the super heavy shells in the US ships actually gives a reading that's, at least at first, appears to be wildly off. And indeed, it is a little bit off because of that extra weight. However, if you're looking at a firepower per ton of the turrets, bearing in mind, as I said, shell weights and armour thicknesses of the turrets are going to skew these values a little bit, it turns out that the twin turret is basically the loser. Bismarck's turret, twin 15-inch, they're huge anyway, so unsurprisingly it comes out with the least firepower per ton of 1.25. However, the next lowest is Richelieu's with 1.33, which is just a fraction below the King George V's twin at 1.34. I suspect that may be because of Richelieu's internally divided armoured bulkhead, upping the weight of that turret. Because, yes, it's a 15-inch turret, but the difference in gun weight between Richelieu and King George V is only 14 tons per gun, but the difference in turret weight between the King George V's quad and Richelieu's quad is about 700 tons. So I suspect Richelieu's internal bulkhead is messing with the figures a little bit there. Next most efficient, or least inefficient, is Littorio with 1.39 in its firepower per ton ratio. Then you have the King George V's quad turret, 1.51, Nelson's triple 16, a 1.54, and then Iowa's Iowa's triple 16, which is by far and away the winner, delivering 1.77 in terms of its firepower per ton. Now you can then compare, how much weight do you need for the ship to deliver its total broadside? Again, now this has two annoying variables, one of which is that some ships have an 8-gun broadside, some ships have a 9-gun broadside, some ships have a 10-gun broadside, and the aforementioned caveats about the fact that different ships have their turrets armoured in different ways. But with that in mind, the notionally most efficient is the King George V, which delivers a 10-gun broadside on 4,879 tons, albeit of 14-inch. Then the next most efficient is the Bismarck, of all things, 5,096 tons of turret and gun, delivering an 8-gun 15-inch broadside. That's followed by Richelieu at 5,300 tons to deliver an 8-gun 15-inch broadside, which is then followed by Nelson, which needs 5,412 tons to deliver a 9-gun 16-inch broadside. Then Littorio, which needs 5,709 tons to deliver a 9-gun 15-inch broadside. And then Iowa at the top of the inefficiency tree now, needing 6,213 tons to deliver a 9-gun 16-inch broadside. And then if you measure it again in a different way, so if you assume that every ship is now firing a 12-gun broadside and adjust the number of turrets as a result, you end up with a completely different listing, because at that point the quad turrets of the King George V become the most efficient, because you need 5,706 tons to deliver a 12-gun broadside, followed, if you're using all quads, followed by the twins from the King George V, which need 6,450 tons, obviously from 6 turrets, to deliver the same 12-gun broadside. Then you have the Nelsons, which need 7,216 tons, with 4 turrets to deliver a 12-gun broadside. Then the Littorios, which need 7,612 tons to deliver a 12-gun broadside. Then getting into the inefficiencies, you have Bismarck with 6 twin turrets, which needs to deliver 7,644 tons of turret and gun to deliver a 12-gun broadside. Richelieu needs 7,940 tons of quad turret to deliver a 12-gun broadside. And Iowa, if it was built basically Montana, needs 8,284 tons to deliver a 12-gun broadside. So you see, every time you measure it in a different way, it changes depending on how you're measuring it. And this is because of all those national variables. Because whilst Iowa, yes, is needing the most weight, the American 16-inch 50 turret, to deliver a 12-gun broadside, on the other hand, its firepower per ton ratio is still the highest because of that heavy shell. And Bismarck obviously goes from being the worst to the best to third worst, depending on how you're measuring it, and so on and so forth. So because of these differences in national characteristics, it is very, very difficult to make any estimation other than, as I said, a direct comparison between the King George V's quads and twins, which show that the quad is by far the more efficient layout. It has a higher firepower per ton ratio, and it only needs, it can get away with about 850 tons less to deliver a 12-gun broadside. And of course, 3 quads are going to take up much less surface area than 6 twins on a battleship. So, the more the better in a single turret. So in theory, the quad turret is the most efficient if every single turret was protected in exactly the same manner and carrying exactly the same gun, firing exactly the same shell. But that's not the way it works in real life. In real life, if you want to deliver the maximum amount of steel to target for a given tonnage of armament, then the turrets pictured, the Iowa-class turrets, are the ones you want. Sean Morrison asks, was Admiral Beatty truly as incompetent as he appeared to be during Jutland? Was he overbearingly arrogant, or, along with arrogant, attempting to single-handedly win an engagement with a high seas fleet before the British battle line could come into range? Beatty seems to have gone out of his way to keep Admiral Jellicoe in the dark while exposing the first battle cruiser squadron to a situation where the opposing German force could have wiped it out. So I think there's two lines to go along here. First, Beatty, I think, definitely was a man promoted beyond his capabilities and really outside his capabilities, because, as I said before, he wasn't a half-bad politician. Yeah, now I feel dirty even saying those words. Anyway, no, he was a fairly shrewd political operator. So he wasn't the world's best naval officer, but he was very good for the Royal Navy in politics. So, it's just unfortunate he had to rise through the ranks of operational command before he could get to a point where his actually sort of top-end skills could come into play and actually be of benefit for the Navy. The other factor, as I said, well, the second part of that element is, as I said, he was, I think, when it comes to tactical command of ships, he was promoted beyond his capabilities. He would have made a fine squadron commander or ship's captain, i.e. where somebody else can make the larger tactical decision-making elements and signalling for him, but put him in natural charge of all of that, and it just doesn't work. The other side to it, which is kind of where the incompetence, I think, comes in, is his failure to recognise his own failings. This is one of the key elements for any kind of leader, whether it be an admiral, a general, a manager, or whatever, is you need to be able to understand your own failings and address them. Beatty seems to have been fundamentally incapable of doing that. He therefore tried to blame everybody else wherever possible. And that comes in with a number of things. Yes, his choice of Seymour, he should have realised at the initial interview, that Seymour was not fully qualified for his job. He definitely should have realised it after Dogger Bank, and, he didn't, and that cost him at Jutland. So he had his priorities wrong. He was prioritising the old boys network over the good of the fleet. That makes him an incompetent in and of itself. His signalling ideas, his intent at Dogger Bank and his intent at Jutland they weren't groundbreaking in the realms of, naval thought, but they weren't bad decisions, but they were badly communicated, which kind of falls back on the previous point. But, his leadership is not particularly inspiring. And then you have the last element, which is not necessarily connected with Jutland specifically, but this is part of this second half of things, but is exemplified by the incident that Admiral King, obviously at a lower rank at the time, witnessed, where Sturdy completely outmaneuvered him, and Beatty had no response to that, and apart from just to throw his toys out the pram and cancel the exercise. So again, that's a mark of arrogance and the fact he isn't actually the most tactically gifted commander on the field. He can execute basic tactics reasonably well, at least in his head, but then thanks to both his own wording and his failure to communicate with others beforehand, and his choice of signals officer, fails completely to communicate that to anybody else. Plus, obviously, he forgets, part of his duty as the battlecruiser fleet is to let Jellicoe know what the heck is going on. He also fails to do that. So, yeah, he is a kind of middle-of-the-road naval officer as far as most things go, but promoted to a point beyond his real capability and with a huge arrogant streak that blinds him to a bunch of his own failings, which then turn what could have been a middling but otherwise serviceable admiral into somebody who got thousands and thousands of people killed. But then perhaps someone who got thousands of people killed through their own stupidity but came away from it scot-free and went on to a successful career where he managed to try and throw the blame on everybody else, perhaps explains exactly why he did so well as a politician. And finally, Meatwad asks, how much damage would a detonation of a secondary magazine do to battleships such as the Yamato or Iowa class? Would it be enough to sink or cripple them? Cripple, certainly. Sink depends on the ship. I know I keep saying that, but it is true. So, for example, the Iowa-class have their 5-inch magazines much more amidships. So, if a 5-inch magazine was detonated, let's say a forward 5-inch magazine, it's separated by a machinery space, some compartments, and an entire deck level from the 16-inch magazines. So if a 5-inch magazine somehow exploded, it might cause some serious problems for an Iowa, because it's going to be expanding. If you take into account going aft as well, it's going to be blowing through a couple of machinery spaces. So it's going to cripple the ship propulsively. Probably going to be only have maybe assuming that none of the other magazines sympathetically detonate, it's going to at least cripple the propulsion. The ship's going to be very slow afterwards. It might, if the explosion is powerful enough, punch out the side of the ship, and then of course, huge amounts of water are admitted to a very large space that's just been created by the blast, and that might be the end of the ship. But it's also possible the explosion might vent or might not have quite the power to expand far enough out to blow a massive hole inside the ship. So, a magazine detonation in an Iowa-class is going to be somewhat... It's going to be dangerous. It's going to cripple the ship, but it may not kill the ship. The flip side is that because the 5-inch magazines are a deck higher and a little bit more central to the ship, it's slightly more likely that a projectile that defeats the main belt protection or the deck protection might actually get in and detonate them. So there's slightly more chance they'll go off, but slightly less chance they'll actually kill the ship. Whereas if you look at something like a King George V with its 5.25-inch magazines, or a Yamato with its 6-inch magazines, those magazines are directly behind the main magazines on the same deck level. So if those cook off, fairly high chance the ship is dead. Because, not so much the magazine explosion itself, but the main magazine detonation it will almost certainly initiate, and toodles to the ship in question. The flip side being that they're down as deep as the main magazines, and they're in the same area as the main magazines, so they're protected by the same armor as the main magazines, so there's a slightly lower chance of of a shell that penetrates the ship's protection actually reaching there in the first place. So, 6 of one, half dozen of the other. Do you want a higher chance of probably being crippled and maybe killed, or a lower chance, but the dice come up the wrong way for you, you are just very, very, very dead? But either way, if a secondary magazine explosion happens, you're out of the fight. And that brings us to an end to this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening. As I said at the beginning, if you are in favour of splitting the Patreon Drydocks over 2 weeks, with the commensurate understanding that that reduces the number of regular Drydocks you get per month by 1, please let me know in the comments below. And if you prefer the current format where you get 3 regular Drydocks, possibly 4 on a good month, and then 1 very, very long Patreon Drydock, again, please let me know in the comments below. I need to get a rough idea of how we're going to take this forward. But nonetheless, the other part is we now have a tentative schedule for the visit to Canada. Yes. So I'll be accompanying Dr. Clark, as I mentioned before. And with the schedule currently, at least the daytime schedule, consists of being on HMCS Haida on the 4th, that is Saturday the 4th of June. Then on Sunday, we will probably be at the Canadian Aviation Museum, possibly also go and check out Niagara Falls, but definitely at the Canadian Aviation Museum. On the Monday, depending on how things work out, this one's a bit more tentative, we may be able to sneak across the border. I say sneak. Don't worry, US Border Control agents. I do have a valid ESTA, from the fact I was in the country in April. And I do have my valid passport and everything. I'm not actually sneaking into the country. It is a figure of speech. Please don't shoot me. Disclaimers aside, on Monday the 6th of June, if the stars align, we might be able to go and see USS the Sullivans and Little Rock. So obviously that's just in the northern part of the US, but that is to be confirmed. On Tuesday the 7th, we'll be flying over to Halifax. On the 8th, that's Wednesday the 8th, we will be on HMCS Sackville. Probably best to check their website because we'll be filming on there, but whether or not it'll be open to the general public is another matter. If it's not, then we'll meet people afterwards. We'll have to make sure publicise time a little bit closer to the time. If it is, then obviously you can hunt us down on the ship. On Thursday the 9th, there's the Museum of the Atlantic. On Friday the 10th, there's the submarine Ojibwa, I think that's how it's pronounced. So again, could meet us outside. Well, actually, to be fair, on a submarine, definitely meet us outside. I don't want to think about trying to do a meet and greet inside a submarine. That would be awful. And then the weekend of the 11th to 12th is time to fly home. So that's the tentative Canada schedule. So you have one or two things, a few times to be confirmed, and whether or not we'll make it to the Sullivans also to be confirmed. But hopefully you can start roughly planning everything around that. So once again, thanks very much for listening, and see you again in another video.